some hold music.
Yeah, I've got it now actually. Hopefully you can see that.
Looks good.
Stream is still working great. Okay, so I've got that there. Okay, so at the moment we're obviously most of us are working from home. It's a bit of a weird time, and but I think after this is all calmed down, it's likely that we'll be seeing more remote work. I think as an industry, a lot of people have been saying that we could be working from home, and that remote work would be a great thing to do more. And I think a lot of businesses have been quite reluctant to let people do it. What's happening now, I think, is proof that it does work, and we can work just as effectively from home as we can from the office. I think it's important as well to say that whilst we can be productive from home and be working from great, it's important to also recognise that it is a weird time at the moment, and it's okay to feel anxious about it, or to feel like you're being less productive, just because it's normal for us to feel weird in these situations. And if we're feeling like we're being less productive, that's fine. It's just what the situation is. But with that bear in mind, this talk is something I've been meaning to put together for a while anyway, and I thought it'd be good to share it at the moment. And often if we form good habits when we're working together in person, they will ensure that when we're working remote, that we can be just as productive then. And these are things that we can introduce while we're in the office and also while we're remote. So the things that we could start doing now. Probably a lot of them you might already be doing, but there might be something that you pick up from it. So if you can do that's great. So this talk's just going to be a few things that that I think are good to introduce. So I'll go through them. The first one is introducing coding standards. It's always good to have an Uncle Bob quote in your talk. So I've got a few in this one. So he says that coding standards are a good idea. Every team should adopt a coding style and standard and stick to it. The code produced by that team should have a consistent look and feel that's devoid of individual preferences and fetishes. So the idea of a coding style is that code should be readable and understandable to all members of your team. You should be able to read the code and not know who's written it by the style in which it's written, in my opinion. Sometimes you'll look at a bit of code and you'll be able to tell straight away on your team who's written it because of the style that they've used or the things that they've used. Ideally, everyone's code will look the same. And that's not because you don't want you to be able to express yourself, but more because it helps you to, if you're writing the same code, then you'll read it a lot easier as well. It does mean that team members need to be mature and leave their own preferences at the door when they're working on the project, but it's better for everyone in the long run. So what should a coding standard dictate? So first of all, style. So how things are named, how classes are named, line length, the infamous tabs v spaces. This is more stuff like the aesthetics of the code, how it looks. It is kind of it's more surface level, but it's quite important because if you're looking around in different places or expecting things to be named differently, then it's going to take you longer to process it in your head. So patterns. So by that I mean things like, is your code, are you going for like a more of an event-driven application? How is the database interacted with? That kind of thing. Whether you're using queues. So those kind of things I think can sort of appear over time, but patterns are important to have a consistent approach to things. Otherwise, when you start doing something new, then you might end up with loads of different ways of doing the same thing, and then it becomes quite confusing to read. Your code structure, that's sort of similar to patterns again, but how things are named, where things are laid out. How code's tested. So do you use unit testing, or are you focusing more on top level tests? How much unit testing do you want? Do you test all the sub paths and the happy paths? Obviously I have a preference on how you test, but that's not what this is about. It's more just sort of saying it's good to think about it as a team. how much test coverage you should have. Are you aiming for a certain amount of line coverage? How objects are created, using factories, and use of version control. So this is one that often doesn't get picked up in standards, but do you prefer more rebase type flow, or do you just do merging? Are you rebasing commits and changing them, or are you just always adding new ones? And use of comments in your code, are you going to have a dot block above everything, or are you only commenting when it's required? So how do you decide on a code style? So I think they should be decided by the team as a whole, especially if it's an existing project where you might have some things in play together. It's good to get everyone together, or in person or on a call, and just go through these things and then decide amongst yourselves which one's the best. If you do end up having ones where you can't agree amongst yourselves, which is probably going to happen because we've all got preferences, then the team lead, like the lead developer or head of the department, should be picking what style, those things, the end decision of it. These standards should evolve over time. So if you think about this like litigation in law, we often refer back to when a particular law has happened or a particular case. You can kind of do the same for code as well. If you can refer back to a time that you've picked a certain style or a certain pattern, then that might be a good way of doing it. You should have them documented, especially the style things. If it's something that's a bit woolly, it's hard to document, but if you document what you can, it's a lot easier to work with. Based off an existing standard, if possible. In PHP, we've got PSR. So have a look at what you can find for an existing thing. And that kind of leads into sticking with language styles. So by that, I mean, if your language, so if the language has a particular way of doing things that most people use, it's good to stick with that, because then if you bring someone else into the team who's not familiar with your code base, but they've worked on lots of other projects in the same language, they'll be able to pick up on those things and keep working with them just because it's consistent with what they've used before. So it's good not to stray too far away from what a language will prefer. So how do you make sure everyone follows the coding standards? There's a few things that you can do for this. So editor config is a good one for style. It's a cross-editor way of defining how your code should look. And so you just check that into your Git repository, and then you can configure most editors to look at that. PHP code sniffer, you can use that to look at what you're trying to check in and see if it matches what your rules are. You can write your own rules for it. It's very flexible. It's quite hard to write your own rules, but you can do it. PHP mess detector is another sort of similar thing where it'll look for different messes. And PHP unit code coverage. The one thing to bear in mind with PHP unit code coverage, as with any code coverage, is actually checking how many lines have been ran in your test. It's not checking what's actually been tested. So you could have a test that's got 100% test coverage, but actually doesn't have any assertions in it. So nothing's actually being tested. But it's a good gauge of how full your tests are. And last of all, your code reviews. The one thing I would say about the top three, your code sniffer and your mess detection, I'd be careful about putting those on your builds or pre-commits and making them break your builds, because they can become quite hard to work with, and they can cause a lot of frustration if they stop you from being able to do a build because something is named wrong. You can do that, but I think it's, in my personal opinion, it's better to have it to just show you what the things that are wrong in is, so you can decide to fix them or not. So code reviews. So code reviews serve multiple purposes. they'll hold the team to the coding standards of the project. Or for some people, they're the last thing that will happen before the code gets merged in, depending on your workflow. They'll help you find problems before testing, and they'll help spread knowledge amongst the team. So what should you cover in a code review? So does it follow your contribution standards? So the code standards that we put in the first step, have those been followed? Will this code introduce any problems? So is it potentially likely to break anything else in the code base, or might it introduce a performance problem? Does the change include sufficient proof that the code does what it's supposed to? So does it have sufficient test coverage? If you think it might introduce a performance problem, has there been a performance test done, and are the results of that attached to the code review? Is there any scope creep in the change? So does the code do what it's supposed to do, but does it also introduce a load of features that haven't actually been intended to bring in? Is there assumptions that have been made that don't need to have been made? So commenting on a code review, if you've been given something to review, what should you look for? So understand the purpose of the reason for the change. So have a look through the ticket if it's got one to go with it, just the business requirements for it, understand why that change has been made. Think about, is your comment constructive, or are you able to supply something useful that'll actually help? I have seen code reviews in the past where people have just responded to a change with the sick emoji, which isn't very helpful. Can you back your comment up? So if you're saying a comment about, like, this could be more restful, for example, if you can back up why that would be a good thing to change, then that will help people to understand it more. So if you can refer back to a standard or a document or something that will explain why the way you want to do it is better, then people are more likely to want to change it. If there's something more fundamental wrong with it, so if you think the whole approach of the code review needs to be changed, consider doing that on a call, because it's just a lot easier to talk through something more fundamental than by putting 100 comments on a ticket. So the life cycle of a code review. So this is going to depend on your project and your company and your industry. So, for example, if you're working in finance or healthcare, you're going to have a very different level of compliance to if you're working on, like, a social media platform or a blog. That's just going to depend on your company. Some are going to want a lot of testing before something gets merged in, so they're going to be happy for a developer to just push them in straight up. So you just need to bear that in mind, what your company is when you're doing that. Ideally, the life cycle should be documented alongside your contributing guide. So along with your code standards, you can write all that stuff up. And really, as a minimum, you should define how many people are required to approve the changes. That might be like you say, this change should be reviewed by 2 other people, or it should be reviewed by 1 or 2 people, and one of them needs to be a lead dev or a senior dev. That's going to, again, depend on what your project is. A good starting point usually is just 2 people. That's what a lot of projects that I've worked on have used, but it's going to depend a lot. So this Google Engineering Practices Code Review Guide is really good. It's really thorough, and they've gone into quite a lot of detail about what their process is, and what the life cycle is and how things are reviewed. That's really worth looking at. If you're looking to introduce a code standard in your company, then that's a great thing to look at to base it off. Pair programming, another Uncle Bob quote. So the main thing about pairing that I wanted to say is that you can do it remotely. It's a great way of sharing knowledge amongst a team. Just get 2 people looking on one ticket. It's a great way of onboarding new hires onto your team. You're not going to learn faster than by actually doing some work with someone who knows what they're doing. And it's a great way of upskilling people on your team as well. So if you've got a junior developer and you want to upskill them to the next level, then getting them working with some seniors or some mid-level is a great way of doing that. It reduces knowledge silos. So if you've got that one person on your team who knows everything about a certain part of your code base, it's, if you start pairing, then it's a great way to reduce that knowledge gap with the other members of your team. And it encourages more experienced team members as well to question their knowledge. If they're explaining something to someone on a pairing exercise, then they're going to be asked questions, and it's going to help them to upskill as well. So remote tools for pairing, you can do it remotely. A video call with screen sharing is probably your best way to do it initially. So you probably do it so the person who's sharing the screen actually does the work and the participant tells them what to do. So then you've got that feedback loop, and then at some point they could swap so the other person is driving and the other person's talking. There are IDE tools you can use to do this. I've not used them myself, but it's worth looking. But I think first a video call is probably just a great way to start. And finally, documentation. So once you've cloned your project from source control, do you have enough information to be productive without any external help? So a good way to think about this is if you're onboarding someone who is in a different time zone, so you can't talk synchronously, will they have enough information to start working straight away? Or are they going to have to keep going backwards and forwards with questions that are going to take a long time to get a response? So the purpose of documentation, I think it should be the second place people look for information, the first place being the code base itself. I think documentation should serve as a container for additional information and context required to understand your project. The code should be self-descriptive, but you're always going to have gaps of knowledge that you're going to need to infer from it. I like documentation to be placed close to the code base as possible, ideally in the same repository to an extent. So I think things I like to see in documentation, an overview of the technologies used in the project. So is it a Laravel project? Is it Symfony? What version of PHP does it use? What dependencies are required for development? So do you need PHP 5, 7, Docker, Vagrant? Just the things that you'd be expected to install to work off it. How can you run it locally? How can you run the tests locally? What coding standards are you using? How can you contribute a change to it? And what's the testing strategy on it? And how to contribute a change. So it's basically all the things that were listed in that code standard. What if I want to create something on this project, what am I going to need to do? And who's responsible for maintaining it? This is more if you're at a big company. If you're working somewhere where you've got hundreds of people and hundreds of repositories, actually tracking down who can help you with something can be quite difficult. So if you're at a big company, put in who's responsible for maintaining the project on the README is really helpful. So tools that you can use for documentation, the README and your project, and you get project, I think is a great place to start. If you haven't got a README, add one, and I think that should be the first place you start to build up your documentation from. I think it's really important to have a good README. Ideally, the README should give you everything that you need to get started. So contributing guidelines, talked about those. You could check those into your Git repository as well. So markdown files, source controlled, I think is a great way to do your documentation. Most tools like GitLab and GitHub can parse markdown. So I think if you use that for those, it's just a great way of starting, because we mostly have the tools to do it already. Also, it means you can parse it in whatever way you want. There's loads of different ways you can view markdown and search it on your computer as well. Confluence is a tool that a lot of people use. I've got mixed feelings about Confluence. I think it's great that people are creating documentation, but at the same time, it feels like it's a bit of a write-only medium. It's easier to add things than it is to find them. So the conclusion for this talk really is that I think having a great team workflow reduces barriers to being productive, and that's the same whether you're local or remote. But it more so it really helps with having a great remote team, and will help you to be really productive when you're not in person, as well as onboarding new people. I think employers who hire remote workers have a much wider choice of talent than those who don't. So even outside of the situation that we're in now, you'll find that if you're in the place where you're employing people, you'll be able to get a much wider pool of talent by stretching your feelers a bit further away. And by having this workflow in place, when you do bring someone in remote, then they'll be able to work a lot faster than otherwise. So to summarise all those points that I've gone through, coding standards to help with consistency and readability on your code. Code reviews will help you to ensure the standards are met. Pair programming is a great way of sharing knowledge and training people up. And documentation helps with onboarding people and sharing the information amongst your team. So any questions? I'm just going to look on the live stream questions now. Just put anything in there. I'll give you 40 seconds or so. Lorna says VS Code Live is great. So I think I've heard of people using that before. I've not tried it myself, but definitely check that out if you want to do remote pairing.
It's really amazing for remote pairing.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, someone's after the Slack link. Is that not on there?
I posted it.
Let me just stick it in. I'm not sure. I think there's two different chats. I'll post that.
I put the Slack link in the YouTube chat.
Okay. Okay, so a couple of questions have come in. So remote pairing, I think a good way to start doing it is just to have two people working on a ticket. One person will do the work, the other one will be guiding the other person along. So the person who's doing the work can share their screen, and then the other person can talk them through what you're changing. You could try and do it with some kind of remote control tool as well. You could do it just a screen share remote control, or you could look into something like VS Code Live. But I think to start off with, just sharing a screen and working through something together is a good way of doing it. Managing time, how do you manage your time? Mark has asked that. That's a great question. For me, I think it was a bit of more of a shock to the system than I expected when I first started doing this, working from home. And the thing that I found has been great has just been taking regular breaks. Managing my time, I just do the same as I would in the office. I tend to be more of the sort of person who picks up a task and just keeps working through it until it's done. I don't know if anyone else has any good answer to that question. I can help to do it on the call if you want.
See, we're getting some joiners to Slack now, which is good to see.
Oh, great.
Slack bots informing me.
Cool. I think we'll leave that one there then for now. If you have any more questions, just stick them in the stream or ask me, or we can chat. We'll take 5 minutes break, and then we'll come back for the next talk.
If you get it going, if you get that PDF Hugh, and start presenting, that'd be amazing. What is behavior-driven development? It's a process, really. It came out of the idea of test-driven development in the early 2000s. A guy called Dan North had this idea, maybe it's not about testing, maybe it's about talking about behavior of the system, which is a slight shift, but a significant one. And really, when we're building software, what we're trying to do, we're trying to go from some business problems that we have, come up with some business solutions to those problems, and then solve those business problems for most of us, through technology. And the problem is, with a lot of organizations, those different stages are all happening in different people's areas of control and different people's areas of understanding. So it might be you have a sort of high-level strategy team who are trying to figure out what the business problems are. Yeah, slide 4, please. You have a whole set of layers of product owners and business analysts who are coming up with these business solutions and saying, here's the feature we're going to build. And then you have developers at the end, and designers and front-end developers and testers who are sort of coming up with the technical solutions that are going to solve those business problems. This is working okay. Thanks, Hugh. So BDD really is a process that tries to help us connect all of these. Is that way around for you? All of these stages of the process in a way that when we're building the software, we know why we're building it. We know when I'm building this software, it's so that I implement these new business rules, new policies, new things that people are allowed to do that they couldn't do before, or things where we're stopping them doing something they could do in the past. And this has all been driven by some business problem that has some metrics around it. If I write this code, it's going to increase the gross profit of the company by increasing the earnings per visit. Trying to have that through line so everyone involved in the process is doing the right thing at the right time for the right reason. Next slide, please. There's behavior-driven development. So next. Dan North came up with the term behavior-driven development around 2000, early 2000s. He was trying to teach people TDD, and he realized TDD is test-driven development, for people who don't know. And in test-driven development, you write the test first before you do anything else. And it's hard to teach people that because it's not natural to write a test first. So Dan started, he developed a tool called JBehave, and he started teaching it to people as, before you write the code, you describe the behavior of the system. In the form of a test, you think of it more like you're specifying what it should do, ideally through talking to other people, and then you implement the code. Defining BDD is notoriously hard. This definition by Liz Keogh is my favorite. It's the art of using examples in conversations to illustrate behavior. So what does that mean? It means that you have to be having a conversation. You have to be able to talk to people about the system behavior. You can't really do BDD in this very fenced off, waterfall-y, siloed way. It's very much an agile practice. You have to be able to talk to business people about the software to do BDD. You have to be talking about the behavior of the system. So the behavior of the system is, how is the system going to operate? What policies is it going to enforce? What's it going to do in a specific situation? And you have to be using examples to have that conversation. So an example is where you give a very concrete, in this situation, this is what the system should do. We'll unpack each of those, but they're very key points. You have to be talking to people. You have to be discussing system behavior. This input causes this output. And you have to be using examples to do that. If you skip along 4 slides, that's just a boring way of explaining it visually. So why examples? BDD really emphasizes giving examples of behavior, but it's not because examples are super important. It's because examples help you understand the business rules, which might sound confusing. I should have said at the start, I am keeping an eye on the YouTube chat. So if you have questions, throw them in there. About 60 seconds later, I'll notice them and maybe answer. So this is a business rule. An example explains rules. Let's move on a slide and have an example of a rule just to be confusing. Oh, God. I don't have my next slide thing. So this is where they fit in, right? The examples exist so that we understand the business rules. The business rules are the important thing. That's key. The business rules are the important thing. We have the examples there so that we make sure everyone understands the business rules. Next, thanks. If I do that, it means next. So this is an example of a rule. We're going to charge our customers sales tax at 20%. Why is it a rule, not an example? It's a rule because it has lots of different inputs. This rule would be applied to lots of different situations, right? And have lots of different outputs. So there's lots of possible purchasing situations. We have this rule, which is like an algorithm, and lots of different outputs. So it's kind of generic. Next slide. Yes, thanks you. I was just doing that to gesticulate, but it worked. So here's an example. If you're explaining this rule to someone, you can check they understand by either giving them an example, or even more powerfully, you can say, okay, if you understand, can you explain back to me how that's going to work? And the developer or tester, whoever that you're talking to, says, okay, I understand. If something's priced at $10, we charge $10 and we charge an extra $2 tax. So really the person's paying us $12 and we reserve $2 of that as tax. This is a good example of ambiguity. This is how an American would understand the rule. Next slide, please. So there's a quick sequence of slides here. You're going to wrap when it seems natural. So if I've got a rule in my head, that's the apple. What I really want is for the other person in the conversation to understand the rule the same way I understand. But if I just explain the rule, maybe there's some rule for ambiguity. I'm regretting. Yeah, that's fine. The icons are fine. Two people talking just on the level of rules, which is the normal way we talk about requirements, actually. If you look at most people's sort of unstructured JIRA tickets, it's full of rules. It says we charge 20% VAT, but blah, blah, blah. You're assuming a reader is going to understand it. And that's a big assumption. That's where a lot of misalignment comes from. So next slide. It's stronger if you can give examples, because the person reading the examples would suddenly say, hang on, those really concrete examples of how the system behavior don't fit with how I thought it should work. Maybe my understanding's wrong. And next. Actually, yeah, I get it. And the most powerful thing is if the person can then give back some examples that the first person, recognizes as true. So if you've got these like models in your head of what the business rules are, and you've got this understanding of these, not vague, but nebulous rules, lots of different situations they could apply to. If you give some really concrete situations and both parties agree, yes, that's what would happen in those situations, it gives you a really high degree of confidence that both people understand the business rule correctly. So think about it that way. Think about examples as a kind of synchronization check. Maybe as a test suite. We'll come to that later. So next, please. Let's go back to the example. We had a rule. Everyone in the room agreed. They understood the business rule. The developer who's just moved to Leeds from New York gave that example, and it gives everyone else the opportunity to say, no, that's not how it would work. It doesn't fit with they run it through their understanding of tax. It doesn't fit. If you look at the next slide, that's not how it works here. It's priced at £10 unless we've, in some trade situations, it's different. if an item's priced at 10, we're going to charge 10. We have to then remember some of that was tax. We then have to, reserve that for our VAT return at the end of the quarter. They're not this quarter because they've been deferred to help us all out. And you can kind of see from this concrete example, there might be more discussion suddenly happens. A tester, it's great to have testers in this kind of conversation. A tester would go, hang on, 167, you've rounded that. Can we have a really long conversation about how rounding works to make sure we understand this properly? The point is to detect the misalignment as early as possible by giving examples wherever you can. Next, please. So when we give an example, what are the important things to try and talk about? One thing is the action. What is someone doing to cause the system to do something as a reaction? And what's the outcome? What is the system going to do? So let's see a concrete example on the next slide. So if I buy a pair of Levi 501s, I'm charged £32.99. It's quite cheap, relatively. There's something missing there. It's not obvious to a reader why buying that pair of Levi 501s, you get charged £32.99. So the sort of third element of an example is what we call context. There's a slide about that. Keep going. Oh, hang on, I could actually open the slides and know what's coming next. That would be an amazing move, wouldn't it? That's a lot easier. So the context is Levi's are listed at £32.99. That's why when I buy Levi's, I get charged £32.99. Sounds trivial. There's two ways of thinking about context. One is you can think of context as the current state of the system. Another way of thinking about context, if you're more of like an event sourcing mindset, what are the things that happened in the past that are also relevant to this action? So if you're doing it in that kind of historical events mindset, you might write that as Levi's were listed in the catalogue at £32.99, right? You'd say, as well as the thing that's happening now, there's some historical events that are relevant to how the system's going to behave. So next, please. When you're generating examples, there are kind of two phases. You want to discover lots of possible examples of how the system should behave. You want to get lots of ideas, lots of options, uncover as much as possible. We call this discovery. We want to find out a lot of scope that maybe no one's mentioned to the tech team yet, or what are the other things we need to think about while we're building this feature. And once we've had that great conversation, hopefully a free-flowing conversation, we want to narrow down, what are we going to build next, that we need to capture some of this in a formal way. So as part of discovery, as soon as you start giving examples, there are some questions you can ask. Next, please, Hugh. One set of things you can ask about is context questions. So these are from Liz Keogh, who I mentioned earlier. She blogged about context and outcome questions. So a context question is, I've already got this example where I buy my Levi's. Is there any situation where I could buy these jeans and I don't pay $32.99? So once you've got that starting example and it's really real and you've got some business stakeholders in the mix, are there any situations you can think of where I wouldn't pay that amount? And next, we suddenly discover, when you're having this kind of conversation, we'll discover lots of situations. Oh yeah, they might be on sale. If they're a member of staff, they'll get the staff discount that no one ever mentioned. If the jeans are damaged, the manager can apply an arbitrary discount. You uncover tons and tons of outcome questions, which is the next slide. As well as me paying $32.99, as well as I'm paying $32.99, what else happens? There might be other things that have to happen as well that we haven't discussed. We're discovering what's happened. And next slide, please. We'll find out loads of stuff. you get charged £32.99. Someone has to dispatch the jeans. They have to get packed. We have to remember that we have to tell the warehousing system that the jeans have been sent out. We have to send them out of stock if it was the last one. Suddenly you discover all this stuff. So the discovery phase of this kind of conversation is really rich. Even for, product owner types who think they've got a really amazing handle on the feature they want to build, and they've been thinking about it for 6 months. As soon as you get into this kind of pattern of giving concrete examples and asking questions, you'll find a lot of their assumptions fall away, and they think, why have I spent 6 months thinking about this on my own? I could have just talked in a group immediately. So let's now look at a format for doing this. Next slide, please. It's called example mapping. Matt Wynne blogged about it in a blog called Introduction to Example Mapping. It's just a way of capturing these rules and examples in a workshop format. It's worth talking about. I've been doing it recently remotely using Miro. I've also done it in the past using Google Drawing and Google Sheets, colouring in cells on a spreadsheet to pretend they're Post-it notes. It all works fine. What's the best way of doing this? I'm going to talk through it. I'll go like this when it's next slide. So next slide, please, for this bit. So you put a sticky for the feature. We're going to talk about the pricing in a shopping basket. And we try and identify what are the business rules. So you just start talking about it. The point of this is you're talking and you're capturing enough information, maybe on a wall or a surface in front of you, as you go, in a kind of gridded way, so you can circle back to things. You remember what you've been talking about. So someone says, oh yeah, we're going to charge VAT. Another rule is that if you pay more than a certain amount, which we want to be configurable maybe, you get free shipping. And while people are talking about the rules, you kind of do this. It's nice that some people can be writing while some people are talking about other things. People start to generate examples. So an example of VAT being applied is, I guess this is the American version. If I buy something for £10, I pay £2 tax. And that might, and you're trying to think, how many examples do I need for someone to understand this business rule? So you probably only need one example for this business rule, because it's just going to be different variations of multiplying by 1.2. Right? There's nothing. That's probably enough for a reader would understand. And what you're capturing on the Post-it note isn't some like detailed example. It's enough that after the meeting you'll be able to write an example down. We'll talk about that in a minute when we talk about formulation. But you're just trying to capture enough detail. So for the free shipping, we might say, if you pay 50 quid, it's free. And if you've got a £10 basket, it's not free, right? So you're just building this map as you go, and naturally people come up with questions. You can capture the questions somewhere else. The colors aren't that important, but these are the official colors, if you want to do it that way. So someone might say, or even while someone else is talking about a different subject, they might just write down, how do we do tax internationally? And also someone else might ask, how do we charge? Do we do this free shipping if they're in a different country? So you have this nice sort of asynchronous thing. The conversation will drift back to the big backlog of questions, and we'll try and map out some more rules. And someone might say, okay, I know how shipping works. Overseas shipping, what's going to happen is we're going to have a flat rate. So we'll have an example where if I live in France, I pay €5 no matter what. And this might be the end of the conversation. I know the guys at Cucumber, they recommend spending 20 to 25 minutes max on one feature in an example mapping session, and then stopping because everyone's going to be tired. Right? But you'll get to some point where you've kind of captured our understanding, and you can have the conversation of, is this in a situation, do we need to talk more about this before we work on it? Can we start work on this if we haven't resolved those outstanding questions? This question about international tax, and this is really contextual. If we were doing sprint planning, could we go into the sprint not knowing how international tax is going to happen, but we know there's someone we can ask, in a couple of days' time and they'll be able to answer, and we feel like we can start the work? Or is it one of those things where we're going to have to go and ask an international tax accountant how it works, in which case maybe we're not ready to start work on this thing? Or either I've frozen or I can't see Hugh flipping them. Yeah, or could we split it along this seam? Next one, please, Hugh. So an option, and it's always good to work on break features down into small things. Great. An option is maybe we can do international shipping later. So maybe we can say, let's just do UK shipping. Let's build the system so if they select a different country, it'll say coming soon, and we can start making money selling to UK customers. And we'll call that another feature. So we'll put that in the backlog. We'll call it international delivery. We can start working on UK shipping this sprint. We've talked enough about it. Everyone understands it. Let's put this thing in the backlog called international shipping. And once we've had a chance to talk to the tax accountant, we'll be able to implement that because we have to figure out how we charge tax. I'm not seeing many questions, so either my chat's frozen or everyone's enraptured. Let's keep going. So that's example mapping. It's one format. You can do it one-to-one. I have done it just talking to one person. You can do it in a reasonably large group. I would say it tops out about the same size as a sprint team. If you've got a massive group, you can actually do it for more than one feature. Stick a load of yellow post-it notes along the wall and people can migrate between them. And it can be interesting to do it in groups on the same feature and then swap over and see what differences you uncover. So you come out of example mapping sessions. Who should be in it is another good question. There's a phrase, the three amigos. Some of the people who are going to build it should be there because it's knowledge transfer. The stickies are not a spec. The conversation is what gets people to the right place. You have to have people who are business experts there, and you really should have testers there. So that's the three amigos. Testers are great at asking those awkward questions, generating that big list of red things that destroys everyone's assumptions. That's what testers are good at. It's good to get them to do that at the start before you've written a line of code. Then get them to do it right at the end after you've shipped it. So next step then, you've had this great conversation. Sometime in the next couple of days, someone needs to write down what you talked about. Right, so you've got to some sort of agreement. Next slide is. We then need to formulate it, and someone needs to make a document and then share it back with the people in that session. So who's going to write that document? Often, it doesn't really matter who writes it. Often it's a developer who ends up writing it, but it doesn't have to be. Matt Wynne has a nice rule, which is that it should be the person who learned the most from the conversation. So if it's a really business-driven conversation, it should be a developer or a tester who then writes up the results, because they're going to share it back. And the person who knows the most can say, yes, that's right, you understood. You get that nice feedback cycle. Yes, you got it right. It doesn't really matter how you capture it. What you want is for it to be familiar to someone who is there. So for teams who are using BHAT or Cucumber a lot, they might start introducing these given, when, then terms. You don't have to. You just want to make sure you've captured the action, the outcome, and the context for each of those examples. So the person writing up is going to have to generate some of that detail. The next slide has an example. Person writing up is going to have to generate some of that detail because you maybe didn't bother talking about it in the session. You thought it was obvious to everyone. Person writing it up then has to write it out explicitly, and then everyone else says, yep, that's what. Around Google Docs, you can start writing Gherkin files straight away. You don't have to at this sort of business level. This could be in a field in your Jira. We've got this rule about shipping. Here's an example where an expensive basket gets free shipping. Given the shipping threshold is 40, when I spend 50 quid and I view the price, it should tell me I've got free shipping. Simple and understandable. In the session, I probably just wrote back, I mean, if you remember on the previous slide, £50 basket is free. And we expect everyone in the conversation understood enough they could go and generate this detail. There's a lot of detail left out. We haven't bothered mentioning what products are in the basket. We haven't mentioned quite a few other things, how things get in the basket. And that's because the example is in this context of explaining a business rule. This is something that's really helps. If you're already doing BDD, this really helps, is to put everything in the context of a specific business rule. It really helps you decide what details to include. It doesn't say whether I bought it on the mobile app or the website or what I was buying, because all that matters for the rule is that it's £40. Okay. So you get to this point. What have you got so far? You've got a way of talking to stakeholders in a nice interactive workshop where you really thrash out the requirements. I often start with discovery and introducing example mapping. And even for teams who aren't doing any testing, no test automation, just having those conversations is a real benefit. And the business people learn to prepare a bit as they go. So they're turning up with less, already worked out ideas. Going away and writing down the examples, feeding them back to the business, and they say, yep, that's what it should do. So now when I build the system, everyone who was in that conversation is going to have a super clear idea of how this shipping thing works. So if you go on a few, Hugh, to the picture. Yeah, this is just, I'm realizing how many slides I have that are just filler. I'm just repeating what I'm saying. So we talked about business rules. They're now illustrated with examples. So we feel like we've got across that diagram. That's fine. You can share that slide. We've got across that diagram. So we've already added value by making sure we've got documented examples that explain to everyone what the business rules of what we're trying to build. The next step is to, after we've built the technical solution, verify it using tests. And we can reuse these examples as tests because they're super concrete. Next slide, please. And this is really where BHAT comes in. BHAT was written by Konstantin Kudryashov a long time ago, BHAT 1. Inspired, let's say, by Cucumber. Cucumber was started off in the Ruby world, and there are cucumbers for most languages. There's a slight distinction. The ones that are called Cucumber tend to be developed by the Cucumber team across different languages. The ones that have other names, so BHAT in PHP, SpecFlow in .NET World, they're part of the Cucumber family, but they've sort of got parallel. They don't really share much architecture a lot of the time, but they have the same principles behind them. And it fits into this overlap. Some of these examples that we generated while we're having those conversations are worth automating as tests. There are going to be other automated tests that we write. BHAT isn't going to be your entire test suite. But there's a nice place where there's an overlap between the stuff we bothered talking about and the stuff we're going to bother testing. So let's see how that works. Next, please. So we can format called Gherkin. You don't need to read this. Let's move on. The top of the file is kind of free text, so you can put anything you want in there. I think it's really useful to document the rules, the business rules that the feature covers. So in this example, it's like, I do training, and if not enough people buy tickets, I'm not going to do the course. And if too many people come, I'll be overwhelmed. So if I was building a system, a course should have a minimum and maximum size. It's viable, as in it's going to go ahead if it hits the minimum size, and once the maximum is reached, we shouldn't sell any more tickets. So this is just a narrative that sort of free text you can put at the top of the file, but it's super useful to have that in there for someone who discovers it later. This file is going to live in your version control. Let's go to the next one. And then we write out all of our examples in this format called Gherkin. Gherkin is shared between the different cucumbers on different platforms, which is really useful. We have a series of steps. We can have a background that's common to all of the examples. So the common background, the common context is that BDD for beginners was proposed with the class size of 2 to 3 people. And then next, please, we have an example. In Gherkin, these were called scenarios. If you're using a recent Cucumber or a recent BHAT, you can call this example instead. You can use the keyword example where scenario is there. It's a bit more easier for people to understand. I was working with someone recently who was like a classics graduate who kept saying scenario whenever we were talking about them. I think examples is kind of easier for people to get on with. So you've got this scenario. The text after the scenario is kind of like what you'd have written on the post-it note in the session. We need an example where the course doesn't get enough enrollments, so of course the course won't be viable. Let's go next. We have an example where the course gets enough enrollments to be viable. Alice already enrolled on the course. Bob enrolls on the course is viable because if you see in the background, it's 2 to 3 people. And the final one, given Alice, Bob, and Charlie have already enrolled on the course, when Derek tries to enroll on the course, he shouldn't be allowed to enroll. So that's pretty, it's only 3 examples, and it pretty much covers all the business rules we talked about in the session. We can then automate tests against the system based on these scenarios. Let's look next. And the way BHAT works is you have a file like this. Each of those given whens and thens is called a step. So you might have lots of feature files in your code base. And BHAT will run through all the features. There's a bit of filtering and tagging you can do. It'll run through all those feature files, and for each line, each given when or then, it's going to execute some code that you've written in a context class. Next, please, Hugh. And all that happens is you have a method on one of your context. You register the context classes with BHAT. What happens is you have a method that has an annotation that matches the line in the Gherkin. And then you have to write some test code in that place. So it's the same sort of code you'd write with any other testing tool. It's the same sort of code you'd write with PHP Unit, Codeception, any of those. It's going to set the system into a state. It's going to do something, and then it's going to check a result. And this is common to the different Cucumbers. Next, please. Here's the same thing in Cucumber JavaScript. You have a function, a JavaScript function somewhere that's going to match the line and then do some test code when it gets to that line. So let's talk about what that code will contain. Next, please. The way people interact with the system is typically most of the things we're building, let's imagine, are web applications. So a lot of our users are going to interact through a web browser. So it's super tempting to only automate your tests on that level of a web browser. However, let's pretend we've got multiple layers inside that stack. You may have more layers than this in your system. It depends how complicated it is. Next, please. And let's look at how you would automate tests at the domain model layer. And this is something you don't see very often in the wild. Execute is pretty much arbitrary tests. So you can easily use BHAT to not write unit tests in the sense most people think of, class level units, but certainly BHAT can test that a set of classes together are achieving a business goal, which is something that your class unit tests maybe aren't doing. Let's see how that looks. Next slide, please. So the idea is to drive PHP objects directly from BHAT. This is obviously going to be fast. You're going to prove that your domain model supports the business action. So think about what that means. When the test passes, it's going to tell me, yes, those PHP classes enforce all the business rules that you talked with the stakeholder about 3 days ago. That's super powerful to know that your classes have that already. Another side effect is that because you've got this close linking, you're going to start making naming choices in your classes that reflect the naming in those scenarios, just sort of naturally. But you can do it very deliberately as well, of course. It's going to execute very quickly. It's going to be as fast as your unit test, let's say. So when I run bhat, let's see the next slide. I'm going to get an output like this, and the yellow, don't worry about reading it. This is the scenarios we looked at before. The yellow means bhat is saying, I don't know automation code for each one. So let's see what test automation would look like driving a domain. Next slide. So when bhat gets to given BDD for beginners was proposed with the class size of 2 to 3 people, it's going to find this method we've got in our class. Because as a developer, I run it. bhat complains it doesn't. This is the sort of TDD-ish approach. I run it, and bhat says, I don't know what to do for any of this. And then I'm going to kind of design the API of my objects. I'm going to say, well, based on that line of text and my understanding I got from the conversation, that gets proposed with a title, that can be a string. Maybe later I'll do a value object. And I'm going to have a value object for a class size that's between a minimum and maximum. So I'm making my design decisions here as I'm writing the bhat automation test. When I run it, let's see the next slide for the bhat output. It's not going to be helpful for thinking. It's the same with TDD. With TDD, you think about what a class's API should be. Here, you're sort of thinking, well, how are these set of classes going to work together? So the first error is there's no course. I'm going to have to go and make a course object. I'd probably write some unit tests for it, maybe using PHP unit. I might use PHP spec, whatever. Do some TDD, make a course object. The next error would be there's no class size object. I'd do my TDD cycle. And at some point, that step is going to be passing. Let's see what it looks like. Next. That step goes green, and I get my endorphin rush that, I've done my little TDD cycle a few times and done red, green refactor class by class, and then suddenly my bhat cycle, the next step passes. Now, this is really useful for organizing my workflow. If I'm building a feature and I've put a bit of time into writing the scenarios, I know what orders to build things in. I'm just going to work down the feature by feature, example by example until everything works. So that's what I do. Let's see the next step. I'm going to work through them all, get the first scenario passing. That's a nice place to commit. I've kind of enforced that the course, one of the business rules I've kind of already enforced. It might be I can deploy it then, and we don't worry about the maximum class size being reached until tomorrow when I deploy that stuff. And I work through. Let's see the next one here. Until everything passes. And then what do I know at this point? I maybe haven't built any UI around this. I might not be actually hooked up to anything in the real world, but I know I've got a set of classes that do the right thing in the right way, and all of the business rules live inside these classes. That's important. The business rules aren't living in my controllers. The business rules aren't living in stored procedures. They're here implemented directly in the classes, and you can show that to someone. Next, please. An alternative, I would say, I wouldn't do both of these, is to restrict your testing to the services level. So if you're driving your domain model from the conversations you had with stakeholders, you're going to get really strong alignment with your between your naming, your concepts, between your classes and the business use cases. Another option is often you'll have a service layer around those domain models, and if you do, it can make more sense to apply a test at the service layer. So let's see what that would look like. Next, please. So we're going to have to configure our services, inject them into bhat. Most of the time that requires an extension, although you can just construct, a load of objects together into a service in your bhat context. And what that's going to ensure is that our service layer API is directly aligned with business use cases. When we're writing service layer tests, when we're driving the domain layer, we don't mind the test cases getting a bit big. But a nice rule of thumb for when you're writing service layer tests is that each line in the in the gherkin that represents a business concept should have an API call. So let's see. So I do a similar cycle. Given BDD for beginners was proposed with a class size of 2 to 3 people, that makes me think that there should be an atomic way of proposing a course with a class size of 2 to 3 people in my service layer without any value objects. So any client, like a controller or a console command, should be able to have a course enrollments service, you can see here, call its proposed method with a string for the title and a minimum integer attendees and a maximum integer attendees. And that should work. The point of having a service layer is to insulate your domain model from all the people using the domain model. I mean, you know, I had a class size value object in that domain model. If I want to refactor that and get rid of that concept, I shouldn't have to go and track down all the places it's found. I should have a little thin layer. Where does this service come from? In this case, if you look at the next slide here, it's being injected into the constructor. And this is why, you know, the constructor could just be constructing it using whatever you've built into your service layer. But in a lot of cases, you might want to use some sort of dependency DI container. And this is why you might want to use a Behat extension to do this. We'll look at an example in a moment. But let's see what course enrollments might look like. Course enrollments object would literally be manipulating the domain layer. They would be exposing a sort of scalar API that then uses a domain objects. And in fact, you may well want persistence to be in there. So here we've got a courses repository, the whole sort of persistence lifecycle. If your controllers are just saying, yeah, propose a course, and it's the service that knows how to tell the database, right, the course is proposed now. A bit off topic, actually. We're going into hexagonal architecture and stuff, but this is just how you would do that kind of testing. Next slide, please. So here's an example in Symfony. If that course enrollment, if I want Behat not to know at all how that service is constructed, which maybe is a nice thing for if I'm going to be messing around with it, I can tell it to get the service directly from my Symfony dependency injection container, which requires an extension. You can see at the bottom grayed out. Someone's had to write an extension. There's more than one Symfony extension. And then I can tell Behat which object to inject into the constructor. Other frameworks, there are other extensions available and various nice frameworks. This is the Symfony one because I do a lot of Symfony. But you can, keep your service construction next to your framework code, the code that drives your website, and Behat can just take the service as is. A quick note on infrastructure is that it's best to run these tests without your real infrastructure, without your real database, without your real queue. It's a much bigger topic that I'll talk about some other time. But if you can put fake infrastructure in place, that's really powerful. So lastly, let's look at Behat driving the user interface. Let's go along to you, please, Hugh. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to talk about that. So I wouldn't run the same tests against your domain model and the service layer. I'd pick one. Quite often I will start driving my domain model from the tests. And then when I feel it's mature, I'll introduce a wrapper, a service layer, and then move the tests to just be going through the service layer. But maybe if I was going to completely remodel it, I'd drop down again. The point of not having too much detail in your scenarios is that you can use them to drive tests at different levels inside your architecture. So now lastly, let's look at driving the user interface. And this is the level that 98% of, I would say, of Behat tests are executing on, and it's the worst layer to test on. So next, please. You can simulate you can drive a browser or a browser simulator from Behat. There are extensions for doing this. One is the Mink extension, or you can just write arbitrary code inside the thing, so you can use whatever browser automation API you want to. And it's kind of interacting with the domain model, but through a few layers of indirection. So going through the UI, it's important because you want to make sure the user interface implements the business rules. But it's the slowest possible testing. It's the brittlest possible testing. If you're only testing at that UI level, people feel free to put the business rule enforcement in the controllers, that kind of thing. So I try and do as little UI testing as possible. Let's look at the next slide. And the thing I see all the time is this kind of Behat scenario. The problem with it is that it's purely UI. So all that detail is just UI detail. There isn't much. This wasn't written in collaboration with a business stakeholder because they don't know what a CSS selector is, and they certainly can't predict what it's going to be up front. They don't know what the paths are going to be up front. This is what you get when you kind of write UI test after the fact, which I'm not going to, shit on, but it's not BDD. It's using the tool for something else. If you don't want to test end to end, a really healthy way of doing it is by testing at one of those lower levels we've already discussed, exhaustively testing all of your scenarios, and then thinking, if I want to check the UI works, what subset of those do I need to be using? If I've got 20 different basket pricing scenarios that I'm testing at the service level, how many basket pricing scenarios do I need to do through my automation tests? Well, what I'm checking is that the span on the page is being populated from that service. So whatever number that service says is populating the span. And that if I add a product, the correct, hit add product to basket, the correct method on that service is being called. So in a lot of cases, I may only want to automate one or two of those scenarios at that UI level, because it would be super redundant to be testing all these different basket pricing scenarios when all that's happening is each time it's just calling the service and showing the result on screen. I only need to dive through the layers once to make sure it's all connected, and I can do all the testing at that lower level. So let's look at the next. Nearly over, don't worry. Overrunning. So we tend to do this. Behat has a feature called suites. Suites let you run the same examples against multiple context, and a context really is a set of automation tests. So up at the top where I've got my services suite, I'm running all of my examples directly against the PHP services, which is going to be relatively fast. This new end-to-end suite, it's got a filter, so it's only going to apply to scenarios that have been tagged. So inside the Gherkin, you can tag a scenario or a feature. Only ones that have been tagged that need to be run end-to-end, they're going to additionally, so they are going to be run against the services, and then additionally, they're going to be run against this end-to-end automation. Let's see what it looks like. Now, the given BDD for beginners was proposed. I'm not going to do that for the browser. I think setting the context, it's fine to do that still through the service layer. Let's look at the next one. When only Alice enrolls in this course, I'm going to use, in this case, we're using the Mink extension. It lets us drive things like Selenium. When a learner enrolls on the course, what that means is someone's gone to the courses page, they've filled in their name, they've clicked enroll. So when it matches Alice enrolls on the course, it's going to type Alice into the box and it's going to click submit. Next one. And the thing where we check if the course is viable, we're just going to look at the courses list and see, does it say it's viable? Now, I might have loads of different business rules around whether a course is viable or not, but that's probably enough for me to have some confidence that the UI is actually connected to my domain model and is showing the results from the domain model. I might want to have a scenario where the course is viable also checked. Next, please. So to automate a real browser, try not to. It's super slow. It's at least, I would say, normally a service level test can run in tens of milliseconds, if that. And a browser-based test is going to run slower than a second. So that's hundreds of times slower. You multiply that across all your scenarios, it's going to add up to a lot. They tend to be flaky. I mentioned that earlier, but you automate. If you're using Selenium, you're like launching Firefox and hoping it launches successfully, and then trying to talk to its REST API and hope those connections don't time out, and then you're hoping the pages load in time from the source and the web server at the other end doesn't hang up. Things just fail randomly. Sometimes automating a real browser is necessary because you need to run JavaScript. Although if you've got a load of service layer, if you're using React or something, component-based JavaScript, you can test all that stuff in the same way I'm testing my PHP services. You can test all those components driven from the same scenarios using tagging. And that might give you enough confidence that you don't really need to test the whole thing all joined up. If you do want to automate a real browser, next slide, please. Depending on your framework, there may be a way of driving it directly. So here, if I'm doing a Symfony website, this is my configuration. And what happens is the Symfony 2 driver, which is so out of date. Symfony 2 came out and we called the driver the Symfony 2 driver. Symfony is now on version 5, but it's just a real pain to rename it. The Symfony driver for Mink doesn't use HTTP. It instantiates the Symfony framework. It makes the Symfony request object. It runs that through the framework and then it examines the response object. There's a similar thing for PSR7 that I helped make. So if you're doing Zend Expressive, or what's it called now? Something else. Or Slim, or something like that, you can drive that directly as if it's a browser and examine CSS on the pages without running a web server, without all of this flakiness. And here in this configuration, I have a Selenium 2 browser configured. The default in Behat is that all of the scenarios will use the first driver that's listed, unless they're tagged as JavaScript scenarios, in which case they'll use the first JavaScript capable driver. So it'll go through the list and ask each driver, can you do JavaScript? Until it gets to one. So in this situation, I could tag some of my scenarios as JavaScript and they would run through a real browser automation. And, I need to take that pain and they'll fail every so often and I might need to retry things, That's that. But try not, if you're doing all those other layers of testing, you don't need to do as much UI testing. That's the takeaway I hope people can have. So the summary is do drive domain objects directly if you want to explore the model and use the conversations you had to come up with naming and stuff like that. If you feel like you're into a sort of maintenance mode, try refactoring so your Behat scenarios are driving services, because then changes inside the domain model won't lead to refactoring the Behat tests, and add minimal UI coverage if you need it. Thank you, Dawn. It's called Laminus, but I can't remember what Expressive is. Zend Expressive has a new name that's not Laminus Expressive. That's all I know. Last slide, please. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. You can see the code I showed was little excerpts from a demo I did a while back. So if you want to see how this would all work in a real code base, a real Symfony code base, there's the GitHub URL. I used to organize BDD London. The plan was to restart it in spring 2020, but maybe for obvious reasons we haven't done that. But if you're interested in BDD, have a look at the Twitter account. There is a Slack that gets a bit of traffic. I'm hoping to do more stuff. Thank you, Lorna. Zen Express is now called Metzio. That was it. That's why I couldn't remember. That's me for now. I can see there have been some questions. Is it appropriate, Hugh and Mark, to answer them now, or do you want to?
Yeah, sure. If people want to stay on the call, yeah, say as long as you want.
Okay. I didn't answer anything mid-flow, so. Can you say BDD takes developers more close to the user? I think it does. That's from Emma. I think BDD is part of making business closer to development and actually making your feedback cycle quicker and driving a kind of agile transformation. But I think it has to be part of a joined up effort to do that. So, you know, you have to also engineer the conditions in your organization where you can get those people together in the same room and start talking about things. Often it's a bit awkward at the start. The business will come in and say, but we've been thinking about this for a year. We wrote it all in the spec. Why would we have this workshop at all? And then within a few minutes, people have asked questions that completely destroy the spec they wrote. And over time, they do less of that upfront stuff and trust more that they're going to get those results through conversation. Someone says it looks like business analysis. It is, but I think putting that business analysis into one person's role is dangerous. Conrad says, does this move to introducing the service layer mean you would refactor your test to use the service layer calls instead of domain objects? Yes. So sometimes I would start testing at the service layer and then just build the objects internally. And actually, that can be a nice way of going fast because you can do a crappy job in the domain model, right? So if you're defining a bunch of services that definitely do enforce the business rules and are tested and have a really shit implementation in the middle, that can buy you some time. If you haven't got a good grasp of what the domain model should be, later you'll be able to refactor that domain model without changing the tests. The flip side is sometimes you think, actually, this is maybe it's something that's core to the application. Maybe it's something that you think is really important, that the domain model is, you know, bulletproof. Testing at the domain model layer, making sure each object is corresponding to terms from the conversation can be much more powerful. But then when you're in that maintenance mode and you think, I might want to change that domain model later, I'd sort of shift it up a bit. It's not that hard, especially in an IDE that has decent refactoring tools. You can extract things and put them in a service object. You're kind of literally extracting from your automation code that's directly driving the objects and putting that in a method and then calling that method on the service instead. So it's not maybe as expensive as it sounds. Darius has already said that in the chat. Great. Mark wanted to know, what do you think about Goot instead of Selenium? Goot, in order of preference, something that drives your framework directly is best. Goot is going to go through HTTP, but isn't a real browser. So Goot is based on curl, effectively. So it's doing a real HTTP request, but then it's not sort of executing it as a browser. It's about 10 times slower than driving a framework directly, and your web server has to stay up. Sometimes you have to do that. I've definitely done that on situations where we've got a nice new, doesn't have to be a nice new framework, nice new Symfony framework for some of the pages, and we can use the Symfony driver and other pages are being driven by some legacy PHP, different entry point for each URL legacy system. We have to use Goot for that because we're not going to be able to hook in and do those code and nice requests and responses. So I use Goot when I can't use directly driving the framework, and I use a real browser if I can't use Goot. Any good books on BDD and DDD? TDD. Kent Beck's TDD book is excellent. A good BDD books, there's a series of books coming out. I should mention I do some work for Cucumber, the company, sometimes, and Seb, who I'm going to mention as an author, works for Cucumber and gives me work. But I mentioned the idea of discovery and formulation being parts of the process, and automation is the last part. So when Cucumber teach BDD, they often talk about these 3 phases. Seb Rose and Gaspar Naj, I'll probably pronounce that wrong, who writes the Cucumber.net called SpecFlow. They're writing a series of books. The discovery book is out. It's very good. It's all about that early process of getting people in the right situation, doing things like example mapping. The formulation book is coming out soon. There's a draft floating around. So I think it'll be out. Well, the plan was it would be out soon. That might be put back. And then there'll probably be an automation book. But I think the discovery book's good and not expensive. No more questions that I can see. Is there any I've missed?
Cool. Thanks, Kieran.